There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew gets shattered in an instant. One of those moments happened to me when my own son, the one I had given everything for, decided that I was no longer welcome in his life. I had spent my entire existence putting him first, sacrificing my dreams, my comfort, my happiness, all to ensure that he would have everything he could ever need. But as the years passed and I grew older, I found myself becoming invisible to him. He no longer saw the father who had worked tirelessly to give him a good life. He saw a burden. And one day, without warning, he kicked me out of the house we had shared for so long, telling me I was nothing more than an inconvenience. It felt like a knife to the heart. The very person I had given everything to was now the one who cast me aside without a second thought. With no place to go, I found myself alone in a small apartment, overwhelmed by the weight of betrayal and loss. But instead of crumbling under the pain, I found a new sense of purpose. I enrolled in an art class, something I had always wanted to do but never had the chance. I started a small online business, pouring all my energy into rebuilding a life I thought I had lost. Months later, the tables would turn. My son, the one who had abandoned me, would find himself in a position of desperation, and that's when he came to me, asking for forgiveness. But by then, I had learned a powerful lesson that would change both our lives forever. Joshua had always been a man of unshakable dedication. From a young age, he was taught that family came first, that sacrifices were part of the fabric of life. He worked tirelessly to ensure his son, Daniel, never had to experience the struggles he had faced growing up. Raised in a modest home on the outskirts of town, Joshua knew what it was like to go without. He had grown up in a small, creaky house that always seemed to need repairs, with a father who worked long hours and a mother who did her best to stretch the family's resources. Joshua learned early on that if you wanted something, you had to work for it. He carried that lesson with him throughout his life, using it as the driving force behind every decision he made. He never took a shortcut, never asked for help, and certainly never expected anything in return for his hard work. Joshua's sense of duty was deeply ingrained in him. As a young man, he found a steady job at a local factory, working the night shift so he could spend more time with his growing family during the day. Every shift he worked, every hour he spent away from his loved ones, was a step towards giving them a better life. When Daniel was born, Joshua's world shifted entirely. He remembered the feeling of holding his newborn son in his arms, promising him that no matter what happened, he would always be there. And he was. Joshua gave Daniel everything: his time, his energy, and most importantly, his love. He didn't just work to put food on the table. He worked to create an environment in which Daniel could thrive. Over the years, Joshua made countless sacrifices for Daniel. There were times when he could have taken a weekend off to rest, but instead he worked overtime to make sure Daniel could go to a private school, join extracurricular activities, and have the things that he never had as a child. He spent countless nights helping Daniel with his homework, teaching him to ride a bike, and comforting him after bad days. Joshua was always there, through thick and thin, doing everything in his power to ensure Daniel had the best life he could give him. But as time went on, things began to change. Joshua grew older, and with age came limitations. His back began to ache from years of hard labor, his energy waned, and the days of working long hours started to take a toll. But Daniel, now a young adult, didn't seem to notice the sacrifices Joshua had made. Instead, he started to focus on his own life, his own ambitions, and his own future. As Daniel became more independent, he no longer relied on Joshua for advice or guidance the way he once did. It wasn't just the physical strain that Joshua felt. It was the emotional distance that began to grow between them. Daniel became increasingly absorbed in his career and social life, often neglecting the family dinners Joshua had always tried to maintain. Joshua tried to be understanding. He knew that Daniel was growing up, becoming his own person, and that was natural. But what wasn't natural was how Daniel began to see him. Not as a father who had worked tirelessly to give him everything, but as someone who was now in his way. Joshua's health continued to decline. His knees hurt from years of standing, and his hands, which had once been strong and capable, were now stiff and painful. The apartment they lived in had become less of a home and more of a reminder of the passage of time. It was a small, two-bedroom place, tucked in the corner of the city, away from the bustling streets, but close enough for Joshua to visit his old friends and former coworkers. The wallpaper was peeling in spots, and the floors creaked with every step, but it was his space. It was where he could be himself, even if it didn't feel like much. At first, Joshua found comfort in the small apartment. He enjoyed the quiet, the space to reflect on his life, and the freedom from the hustle of his younger years. He started to embrace the things he had put aside for so long. Reading books he'd never finished, watching old movies, and spending time alone. He was starting to find peace with the changes in his life, but then, in a single moment, everything fell apart. It happened one afternoon when Joshua's body was aching more than usual, and his hands were trembling as he tried to tie his shoes. He had just finished a small project around the apartment. A simple task, but one that had taken him longer than it should have. Daniel arrived, and without any warning, his words struck Joshua like a slap in the face. "You're not the man you used to be," Daniel said with a bitter edge in his voice. "I can't keep taking care of you. You're slowing me down. I need you out of here." The words echoed in Joshua's mind, and for a moment, he thought he hadn't heard them correctly. But when he looked at Daniel, standing there with a cold look in his eyes, Joshua knew it was real. His own son, the one he had given everything for, was telling him that he was no longer welcome in the home they had shared for years. The man who had once, tirelessly for Daniel's happiness, was now being discarded like yesterday's trash. Joshua was heartbroken, but he didn't show it. His face remained calm, though the weight of the betrayal pressed down on him. He couldn't comprehend it at first. How had they come to this? How had the relationship he had poured his life into become so fractured? And so he left. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply gathered what little he had and walked out the door. Joshua stood in the doorway of the apartment he had shared with Daniel for over 2 decades, his suitcase in hand, staring at the life he had built and now had to leave behind. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of traffic from the streets below. His heart felt heavy, as though the weight of betrayal had wrapped around it like a vice. But he said nothing, made no attempt to argue or beg. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the place that had once been a home but had now become a symbol of rejection. It wasn't just the physical act of being kicked out that hurt. It was the years of sacrifice, the countless hours of work, the dreams he'd put on hold. All of it seemed to mean nothing to Daniel. Joshua had always told himself that one day Daniel would understand, that the sacrifices he made would eventually be recognized. But that day never came. Instead, what had started as a quiet distance between them over the years had now erupted into something far more painful. His son, the person he had given everything to, had pushed him out when he was most vulnerable. As Joshua made his way to his new, small apartment, he couldn't help but reflect on the years leading up to this moment. Daniel had changed over time, becoming more absorbed in his career, more focused on his own life. At first, Joshua had written it off as part of the natural progression of things. His son was growing up, becoming independent. But over time, Joshua noticed a shift. The small gestures of kindness, the gratitude that had once been there, slowly faded. It wasn't that Daniel was outright disrespectful, but his words and actions became more careless, more self-centered. Joshua had always been there for Daniel from the very beginning. Every school play, every soccer game, every tough situation, Joshua had been by his side, supporting him through it all. And when Daniel had faced his own struggles as an adult, failed relationships, career setbacks, Joshua had been the one to offer a helping hand. Yet, as Joshua had aged and his body began to slow down, the support he had once given so freely was no longer reciprocated. The first real sign that something was wrong came when Daniel stopped coming by as often. At first, it was just a few skipped visits here and there, followed by longer gaps between conversations. Joshua tried to brush it off, telling himself that Daniel was busy with work, that it was nothing personal. But deep down, he felt the distance. It was as though the bond they once shared was fraying, unraveling bit by bit. And then, when Joshua's health started to decline, the visits became even less frequent. He had always been the one to care for others. It had been his role in the family for as long as he could remember. But when it was his turn to be cared for, it became clear that the rules had changed. Daniel, the son he had raised and supported, had become someone unrecognizable, a stranger who no longer had time for his father. The pain of that realization was worse than any physical ache. Now, as Joshua sat alone in his new apartment, the familiar sounds of his old life, laughter, conversation, the hum of activity, felt like echoes from a distant past. The loneliness wasn't just a product of physical space. It was the emotional void that came from being rejected by the one person who had once meant everything to him. And yet, even in the face of this crushing disappointment, Joshua knew one thing for certain. He would not let this defeat him. It was difficult, of course. The nights were the hardest, when the silence seemed to stretch on forever. There were times when Joshua would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the years of hard work he had put into providing for Daniel, only to be thrown aside when he could no longer give. He wondered what went wrong. How had they arrived at this point? How had his son, the boy he had raised with so much love and care, become so cold and indifferent? But Joshua didn't dwell in self-pity. He couldn't afford to. He had to keep moving forward. Despite the pain, he knew that wallowing in grief wouldn't help him. And so, he did what he had always done. He focused on what he could control. He enrolled in an art class. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Art had always been something Joshua had loved, something he had pushed aside in favor of more practical concerns. But now, with his life in a state of flux, he decided to pursue it. It was a small step, but it gave him something to look forward to. He rediscovered his passion for painting, and with it, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Joshua also started a small online business, selling his artwork. It wasn't lucrative at first, but the act of creating something, of putting a piece of himself into his work, helped him heal in ways he hadn't expected. The online business grew slowly, but it gave him the freedom he hadn't had before. For the first time in a long time, Joshua felt like he was in control of his own life. Meanwhile, Daniel's life, though outwardly successful, began to unravel. His career, once on the rise, started to stall. He faced challenges at work that he couldn't overcome, and his personal relationships began to suffer. The distance between him and the people who had once been close to him grew. But the hardest part came when he began to realize the true cost of his actions. The man he had rejected, the father he had cast aside, was doing just fine without him. And Daniel, now struggling in his own way, began to understand the depth of his mistake. Months passed, and the tension that had built between father and son began to shift. Daniel, now facing his own crisis, came to a stark realization. His pride had cost him everything. And it was in that moment that he knew what he had to do. He needed to make amends, to seek forgiveness from the man he had wronged. But would Joshua be willing to forgive him? And would Daniel be able to truly learn the lesson that would change both their lives forever? Joshua's days in the small apartment became a blur of routine. Wake up, paint, work on his online business, and then back to painting. The world outside seemed to be moving at a frantic pace, but Joshua's life had slowed down, almost to a standstill. It wasn't a life of excitement or adventure, but it was a life of peace, something he hadn't known in years. Yet, every moment was tinged with the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. It wasn't just that Daniel had kicked him out of their shared home. It was the weight of the years spent sacrificing, the years of devotion that had meant nothing in the end. Joshua had spent his entire adult life pouring everything into his son. He worked long hours at jobs he hated, skipped vacations, and put his own dreams aside, all to make sure Daniel had the opportunities he never had. Yet, when Joshua needed his son most, when his body began to betray him, and he needed help, Daniel couldn't see past his own ambitions to notice. Joshua didn't want to admit it, but deep down he had known that something was changing in Daniel long before the final break. It had started small, Daniel canceling family dinners, not showing up for the things that once mattered to him. But Joshua had brushed it off, telling himself it was just a phase. Now, in the aftermath, he could see it all clearly. Daniel had been drifting away from him for a long time. The rejection hurt so much more because of the years of blind devotion Joshua had given to his son. He hadn't been just a father. He had been everything for Daniel. And Daniel had grown to see him as nothing more than a problem to solve, an obstacle in his path. The pain of the abandonment was a constant ache that gnawed at Joshua's insides. Every time he thought about it, the memories of everything he had done for Daniel played out like a cruel movie. He remembered Daniel's first steps, the way his son's face would light up when he came home from work, the late-night talks they had when Daniel was a teenager. But that boy, the one who had once looked up to him, had vanished. Now, Joshua was left with a cold, unrecognizable version of him, someone who saw his father as a burden rather than a parent. Despite his bitterness, Joshua refused to wallow in self-pity. He couldn't. The work he had started in his small apartment kept him grounded. Art became his solace, the one thing that allowed him to express the emotions he didn't know how to deal with otherwise. The paintbrush became his voice, and the canvas his refuge. Every brushstroke was an act of defiance against the pain, a way to reclaim some piece of himself that had been lost in the shuffle of years spent in service to others. But the isolation was beginning to take its toll. Joshua had no family left to lean on. His wife had passed away years ago, and the few friends he had were either too busy with their own lives or too distant to offer much support. The loneliness became louder with every passing day, filling the apartment with an emptiness that was impossible to ignore. It was at night, in the quiet darkness, that the weight of it all would come crashing down on him. The thoughts of Daniel, the thoughts of his betrayal, would flood his mind until he couldn't escape them. And then there was the constant self-doubt. Joshua had always prided himself on being strong, on being the one who could hold everything together for the people he loved. But now he questioned his own worth. Had he been a failure as a father? Was it his fault that Daniel had turned away from him? Had he been too blind to see the signs, too absorbed in his own role as a provider to notice his son slipping away? It was a dark spiral of thoughts, one that threatened to pull him under if he let it. But Joshua fought it, each day fighting to keep his head above water, to hold onto his sense of self. There was no going back now, no undoing the past. But there was still a chance to rebuild, to find meaning in the life he had left, to rebuild his sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was slowly deteriorating. The career that had once seemed so promising was now full of roadblocks. The financial stability he had once enjoyed was beginning to unravel, and the relationships he had taken for granted were starting to crumble. It was as if the universe had turned its back on him, much like he had turned his back on his father. Daniel had always been driven by success, by the need to prove himself, to outdo everyone around him. But now the very things he had prioritized above all else were slipping through his fingers. He had burned bridges with co-workers, alienated friends, and found himself increasingly isolated. The more he tried to control his life, the more things seemed to slip away. And that was when the realization hit him hard. He had pushed away the one person who had always been there for him. The one person who, despite his flaws, had never let him down. Daniel's career wasn't the only thing falling apart. His personal life, too, was suffering. The relationships that had seemed stable now seemed fragile. The pressure was mounting on him from every direction, and the guilt began to settle in. His relationship with his father, which had always been complicated, now felt like an unhealed wound. One night, after yet another failed attempt at solving a problem at work, Daniel sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. He thought about Joshua, the man who had given him everything, and whom he had cast aside without a second thought. In that moment, Daniel understood. He understood what his father had been trying to teach him all along, the value of family, of respect, of unconditional love. And he knew that if he didn't act soon, he would lose it all, his family, his integrity, and his sense of self. The days grew longer for Joshua, the weight of his loneliness settling deeper into his bones. The art that once filled his days with purpose now felt like an echo, a reminder of everything he had lost. Painting had become more than just a hobby. It was his lifeline, a quiet way of expressing the emotions he couldn't verbalize. But even as the brushstrokes grew bolder, even as he poured his heart into each piece, the emptiness remained. Joshua had come to terms with the fact that his relationship with Daniel might never be the same. Yet, despite the rejection, there was still a small part of him that yearned for some form of reconciliation. He couldn't help but remember the son he once knew, the boy who, with his bright eyes and boundless energy, filled their home with hope and promise. What had happened to him? Where had the respect gone? And more than anything, what had driven Daniel to act in such a cruel and heartless way? There were nights when Joshua would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had failed his son. Was there something he missed? Something he could have done differently? He wrestled with the guilt, the haunting thought that somehow his own actions had caused the rift between them. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. He had done everything for Daniel. He had given him the best of everything, a life filled with opportunity, love, and support. In the end, though, it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough for Daniel. Meanwhile, Daniel's world was falling apart at the seams. He couldn't escape the crushing weight of regret, which seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. He had always believed that success would fix everything: his career, his relationships, his life. But now, everything he had worked for seemed hollow. The job he had once prided himself on felt like a cage, his every effort falling short of expectations. His colleagues whispered behind his back, his clients were starting to question his abilities, and his sense of security was slipping through his fingers. But it wasn't just his career. The strain in his personal life was becoming unbearable. He had pushed his friends away, isolating himself with his ambition, and now they were all but gone. His relationships had become transactional, just another means to an end. Even his latest girlfriend, whom he had once seen as his partner in life, had started distancing herself. She had been patient with him, understanding his drive for success, but even she had her limits. The true breaking point came one evening when Daniel was sitting alone in his office, the papers and deadlines scattered in front of him. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound, and in that quiet, he found himself facing a question he had avoided for months. What was the point of all this? He had everything: career success, financial stability, but nothing else. The emptiness was suffocating, and the man who had once been so full of life, so driven by ambition, now found himself paralyzed by the weight of his choices. His thoughts turned to Joshua. It had been weeks since he last thought about his father, since the day he kicked him out of the house. But now, in the midst of his failure, Daniel couldn't avoid it any longer. He had pushed Joshua away in the name of independence, convinced that his father was a burden. But now, more than ever, he realized the truth. It wasn't Joshua who had been the burden. It was his own pride, his own inability to see the value of family and love. Daniel's heart ached with the knowledge that he had wronged the one person who had always been there for him, no matter what. His father had given him everything: his time, his energy, his unconditional support, and he had thrown it all away. And now, as the cracks in his own life deepened, Daniel felt the weight of that loss. It wasn't just the loss of his father. It was the loss of his integrity, the loss of what truly mattered. His mind raced as he replayed the moment he had kicked Joshua out. He could still hear his father's calm response, the quiet resignation in his voice. It haunted him. Daniel had been too proud, too selfish to see that his father's love wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was something he had taken for granted, something that, in his naivety, he believed would always be there. But now it was gone. Daniel's guilt was overwhelming. He had always thought that he was the one who was in control, that success was the measure of his worth. But now, he realized the harsh truth. Success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with, no one who truly cared. His world was crumbling, and all he wanted, more than anything, was to fix what he had broken. But how could he do that? Could he ever make amends for what he had done? Could he repair the relationship with his father, or was it too late? Daniel didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain: he needed to try. He couldn't keep living in this self-imposed prison of pride and regret. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, to swallow his pride and ask for forgiveness. He picked up his phone, his fingers shaking as he typed the words he had been avoiding for so long. "Dad, I'm sorry. Please, I need to talk to you. Can you forgive me?" As he hit send, Daniel knew that his journey to redemption had just begun. But whether his father would be willing to forgive him, whether they could rebuild what had been broken, was still uncertain. The emotional stakes had never been higher, and Daniel knew that this was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. The weeks that followed Daniel's apology to Joshua were agonizingly uncertain. Every day, Daniel replayed the events in his mind, how he had kicked his father out, how he had turned his back on the one person who had always loved him unconditionally. His apology, though heartfelt, had come late. He knew it. Joshua had every right to reject him, to turn his back on him the same way Daniel had done to him. Yet, despite the fear and guilt that gnawed at him, Daniel couldn't stop himself from reaching out. The text message he had sent was met with radio silence. Joshua had always been a man of few words, but this silence was deafening. Daniel couldn't decide if his father was still processing the pain or if he had truly closed the door forever. Each moment of waiting felt like an eternity, and Daniel's self-doubt intensified with every unanswered day. He tried to focus on work, on his career, but nothing seemed to matter. The once thriving ambition that had always propelled him forward was now a hollow echo, empty and meaningless. Meanwhile, Joshua, though hurt and disillusioned, had been wrestling with his own emotions. The truth was, the apology from Daniel had shaken him to his core. Part of him wanted to believe that his son was sincere, that this was the moment of realization he had been waiting for. But another part of him, the part that had suffered for so long, was hesitant, unsure if this apology was enough to erase the years of neglect. Joshua's love for his son was unwavering, but his pride, the dignity he had fought so hard to retain after being cast aside, held him back. Could he forgive Daniel? Could he ever trust him again? In the quiet of his small apartment, Joshua picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating before he typed a single line. "I'm not sure if I can forgive you, Daniel. I need more time." It wasn't the response Daniel had hoped for, but it was the truth. Joshua wasn't ready to let go of the years of hurt just because his son asked for forgiveness. Forgiveness, Joshua realized, was something that needed to be earned. It wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about proving that you understood the consequences of your actions and were truly committed to change. Joshua had given Daniel everything for so long, but in the end, he couldn't just give his forgiveness away. It had to mean something. As Joshua stared at the message, a small sense of relief washed over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had control again. It was the first step toward healing, acknowledging that he wasn't just a victim of Daniel's actions, but a man who had the right to decide his own fate. The power, for the first time in a long while, was in his hands. Daniel, on the other hand, felt as if the weight of the world had crashed down on him when he received Joshua's response. "I need more time." The words were simple, but the message was clear. Joshua was still hurt, still processing the betrayal. Daniel could feel his stomach drop. He had expected a miracle, a quick fix, but now he realized that his journey to redemption wouldn't be an easy one. This was the moment when the reality hit him. Forgiveness wasn't a one-time exchange. It was a process, something that required patience, humility, and unwavering dedication. That night, Daniel lay in bed, thinking about the message. He had hoped for immediate relief, but instead, he was confronted with a deeper truth. The revelation was startling. He had never truly understood the value of forgiveness before. He had always thought of it as a quick fix, a way to smooth over mistakes without facing the consequences. But now, he understood that forgiveness wasn't about making things right instantly. It was about the journey, the long road to rebuilding trust and showing that he was truly committed to change. The weight of his actions became painfully clear. He had abandoned his father, ignored his love, and only now, when his own life was crumbling, did he realize how much he needed him. But it wasn't just about his own need. It was about proving to Joshua that he had learned, that he could be better, that he was capable of becoming the son his father deserved. Daniel wasn't sure where this path would lead, or if his father would ever fully forgive him. But one thing was certain. He was ready to prove his worth. He was ready to show his father, and himself, that he could change. Joshua's response, though painful, marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. It was the first step toward healing, the first step toward rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered. And even though they weren't there yet, both father and son now understood that forgiveness, like love, wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It was a gift, one that had to be earned, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel was willing to do the hard work. The air was thick with anticipation the day Daniel decided to take the next step. The weight of the message Joshua had sent still sat heavy on him. "I need more time." It had been weeks since that reply, and while it hadn't been the response he had hoped for, it had made one thing painfully clear. Joshua wasn't going to just forgive him. Not without seeing that Daniel truly understood the depth of what he had done, not without seeing a change. The realization that forgiveness wasn't instantaneous but earned was the catalyst for Daniel's next move. Daniel sat in his small apartment, staring out the window. The city skyline stretched before him. It was a perfect metaphor for his life. It looked impressive from a distance, but up close, the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. His career was falling apart, his relationships were in shambles, and the one person who had always been his anchor, his father, was still out of reach. But the realization that Joshua was still processing everything, still figuring out if he could trust his son again, sparked something inside him. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of urgency. He had always been someone who relied on his ambition, on his ability to fix things, to succeed. But now, all the success in the world meant nothing. His father's forgiveness was the only thing that mattered. He had to prove to Joshua that he wasn't the selfish, entitled man who had cast him aside. He had to show him that he had changed, that he was willing to put in the work to rebuild what he had broken. Taking a deep breath, Daniel picked up the phone. This time, the message would be different. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It wasn't just an apology. It was a commitment. "Dad, I know I can't erase what I did. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't fix overnight. But I'm not asking for you to forgive me right now. I'm asking for a chance to prove to you that I can be the son you deserve. I've learned that forgiveness is earned, not given lightly, and I'm willing to do the work. All I'm asking for is that you let me try. Please." With trembling fingers, he hit send. He didn't know if Joshua would even read the message. He didn't know if it would make a difference. But for the first time, Daniel was doing something he had never done before. He was being vulnerable. He was acknowledging the full weight of his actions, and he was giving his father the space to process everything. Joshua, on the other hand, had been struggling with his own decision. The silence that had hung between them for weeks was suffocating. He had tried to move on, to focus on his art, to give himself the space to heal, but Daniel's words, the ones he had read in that brief, emotionally charged message, kept returning to him. "I'm asking for a chance to prove to you that I can be the son you deserve." The words felt raw, genuine, but they also carried the burden of their past. Joshua had to admit, for the first time, that he wanted to believe his son. But did he dare hope for a real change? Could he let go of the years of hurt and disappointment? Could he open his heart again after it had been shattered so many times? Joshua's hand hovered over the phone. He knew that if he responded, if he reached out, it would mean reopening a door he had been trying to keep closed. But as he sat there, staring at the screen, he thought about the man Daniel had once been, the boy he had raised, the young man who had been full of promise. Could that person still be there? Could he find his way back? After what felt like an eternity, Joshua finally typed a response. It was simple, but it was a beginning. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Daniel, but I will give you a chance to prove yourself. If you're truly ready to change, then I'll listen." As soon as he hit send, a wave of emotion crashed over him. Part of him felt relief, a small, cautious step forward. But another part of him felt fear. Fear of being let down again. Fear of opening up to someone who had hurt him so deeply. Yet, there was something inside him that refused to give up hope entirely. His son might have abandoned him, but Joshua still had the capacity to love. He still believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption. Daniel read the message, and the weight of it hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a grand gesture of forgiveness, but it was something far more meaningful. It was a door slightly ajar, an invitation to try, to show that he was worthy of being trusted again. His heart raced as he processed Joshua's words. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. This was the chance to prove that he could be the son Joshua deserved. The realization was powerful. Forgiveness would take time, but Daniel was willing to do whatever it took to earn it. He was ready to face the consequences of his actions, to prove that he could be better, and most importantly, to show his father that their bond, broken as it was, could be repaired. The moment Daniel read his father's reply, he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. Joshua's message wasn't an affirmation of immediate forgiveness. It wasn't the reunion Daniel had fantasized about, but it was a crack in the door, a fragile opening to the chance he had longed for. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Daniel, but I will give you a chance to prove yourself. If you're truly ready to change, then I'll listen. Those words were both a relief and a challenge. Daniel felt a rush of emotions. Hope, guilt, fear, all tangled up in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But it wasn't the triumphant victory he had imagined. It was raw. It was real. It was the first step, and now it was up to him to walk the path. For the first time in his life, Daniel realized that success, true success, wasn't measured by achievements or accolades. It wasn't about business deals or career milestones. Success, now, was about proving his sincerity to the one person who had always been there for him, his father. And he would do whatever it took to show Joshua that he had changed, that he was no longer the selfish, entitled man who had thrown him out. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he had never thought he would have to call. He wasn't sure what to say, how to start the conversation, but he knew that this was the moment when words needed to turn into actions. He couldn't expect to regain his father's trust with words alone. It was time to show up, to prove that he was worthy of the second chance Joshua had given him. When the phone rang, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The seconds felt like minutes, the anticipation almost unbearable. Then, finally, he heard the familiar voice on the other end of the line. Hello. It was Joshua. His voice, though steady, held a distance. There was no warmth in the greeting, no eagerness to reconnect. But Daniel was prepared for that. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. Dad, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. I just wanted to thank you for giving me a chance. I know I don't deserve it, and I don't expect anything from you. But I want you to know that I'm committed to proving to you that I can be the son you deserve. Joshua's silence on the other end felt like a weight, and Daniel's anxiety grew. But then Joshua spoke, his tone measured. Words are easy, Daniel. It's actions that matter. If you really want to make things right, you'll have to show me. Daniel nodded, though he knew Joshua couldn't see him. I understand, and I'll prove it to you. I don't have all the answers, but I know I have to earn your trust. It won't happen overnight, but I'll be here doing the work. Joshua let out a quiet sigh. I've heard all the promises before, Daniel. This is your chance. Don't waste it. The conversation ended shortly after, leaving Daniel with a knot in his stomach but a new resolve in his heart. It wasn't a resolution to fix everything in an instant. It was a resolution to prove that he could change. He knew it was going to take time, but for the first time, he was willing to put in the effort. He would no longer be the man who ran away from responsibility, from his family, from the truth. Over the next few weeks, Daniel made a concerted effort to show up for his father in ways he had never done before. He took on small, meaningful actions, calling regularly, checking in on Joshua's health, offering help without expecting anything in return. Every gesture was a piece of the bridge he was building, one that spanned the gap of years of neglect and misunderstanding. He didn't demand that Joshua open up immediately or forgive him right away. He understood that this would be a long process, but he was willing to do whatever it took. Joshua, on the other hand, began to observe his son in a new light. He didn't expect miracles, but he saw the effort in Daniel's actions. There were moments when he felt his guard slipping, when he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his son was different now. But the walls Joshua had built around his heart didn't come down easily. Every time Daniel reached out, every time he showed up with sincerity and humility, Joshua's heart softened just a little. The real test, however, would come when Daniel faced his biggest challenge yet, taking responsibility for his past mistakes, admitting the full extent of his selfishness, and asking for forgiveness, not just from Joshua, but from himself. One evening, as Daniel sat in front of his easel, painting with the same intensity he had poured into his work for months, he had an epiphany. Forgiveness wasn't just about his father, it was about him too. He had spent so many years running from the reality of his own mistakes, hiding behind excuses and pride. But now, the truth was clear. He had to forgive himself. Only then could he truly be the man he was capable of becoming. As he finished his painting, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't done, and he knew he would have to prove his worth over time. But the journey had begun, and for the first time, he felt ready. The journey toward reconciliation was long, slow, and at times uncertain. But it was in the quiet moments, the small gestures, that the transformation began to take shape. As weeks turned into months, Daniel continued to show up for his father in ways he never had before. He started taking an active role in Joshua's life, from helping around the house to simply spending time together. They didn't have deep conversations at first, but those moments, the simple ones, sitting in silence together, having dinner, or taking walks in the park, spoke volumes. Joshua, while still wary, began to sense the change in Daniel. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't expect anything in return. He didn't need Joshua's approval or forgiveness to feel complete. It was as though, for the first time, he was learning to forgive himself. His focus shifted from earning forgiveness to simply being present, to showing up for his father the way he had failed to do for so long. Joshua, in turn, began to open up cautiously at first. He had spent so many years guarding his heart, building walls around his emotions to protect himself from further pain. But with each passing day, the walls began to soften. His heart, though scarred, began to heal. The way Daniel showed up with no strings attached, the way he quietly proved his sincerity, began to chip away at the bitterness that had once consumed Joshua. It wasn't that Joshua had forgotten the hurt. It was still there, a scar that wouldn't easily fade, but he was learning that love, real love, required forgiveness, not just of others, but of oneself. He had carried the burden of anger and resentment for so long that, in time, he realized it was holding him back more than it was protecting him. One afternoon, Daniel sat down with his father in the living room. Both of them settled in their usual chairs by the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the room. It was one of those rare moments where time seemed to stand still. Daniel looked over at Joshua, who was absent-mindedly flipping through a book, his mind seemingly elsewhere. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About what happened, about what I've done, and about what I still need to do." Joshua looked up from the book, his gaze meeting Daniel's. He hadn't said much over the past few months, but he could feel the weight of his son's words. This wasn't just an apology, it was a commitment. Daniel wasn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He was living it. "I know I can't fix the past," Daniel continued, "but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm here for you, for us. I'm not perfect, and I never will be, but I want to make things right." Joshua set the book aside and sat back in his chair, a soft sigh escaping him. He had heard the words before, but something about the way Daniel spoke them now, with no expectation, no urgency, made them feel different. Joshua had always believed that actions spoke louder than words. And in the months since Daniel had reached out, his actions had spoken volumes. "I've watched you," Joshua said quietly, "and I can see the change. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget how I felt when you kicked me out, but I can see that you're trying, and that means something to me." Daniel's heart raced as he listened to his father's words. He had waited so long to hear them, but now that they were finally here, they didn't feel like a victory. They felt like a beginning. Joshua's voice softened further. Forgiveness, it's not something you can rush. But I'm willing to let go of the anger. I'm willing to give us a chance, Daniel. Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt the release he had been longing for. He didn't need his father to wipe away all the pain. He just needed this moment, this acknowledgement that they could rebuild together. "I'll keep proving it to you," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day." Joshua nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength. "I know you will." In that moment, they both knew that while the road ahead would still have its challenges, it was no longer about the past. It was about the present, and the possibility of a future where love and respect could be rebuilt piece by piece. The emotional weight that had hung between them for so long began to lift. It wasn't gone entirely, and it would take time for full trust to be restored, but they had made it through the hardest part. They had taken the first steps toward healing, and both of them, in their own way, had found a sense of peace. For Joshua, the realization that his son was willing to work for forgiveness meant more than anything. And for Daniel, the understanding that love was a journey, not a destination, brought him a sense of clarity he had never known. He had learned that forgiveness wasn't just something you asked for. It was something you earned, and it was something you gave, not only to others but to yourself. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, both father and son knew they were on it together. Have you ever felt the weight of betrayal or struggled with a fractured relationship? Have you been in a situation where you wanted to fix things but didn't know how to begin? Daniel's journey of redemption shows us that healing is possible, even when the wounds run deep. Forgiveness isn't always immediate, and it's not always easy, but it's a process worth fighting for. If you've ever had a falling out with someone you love, now's the time to ask yourself, are you willing to take that first step towards reconciliation? It may not be easy, and it might not happen overnight, but like Daniel, you can choose to show up, take responsibility, and prove through actions that you're committed to change. Think about the relationships in your life. Is there someone who needs to hear from you? Is there someone you need to forgive, or someone you need to ask for forgiveness? The truth is, none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, but it's how we handle those mistakes that defines us. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever been in Daniel's shoes? Or maybe you've been the one who needed forgiveness. Let's open up the conversation and talk about how we can all learn from each other's experiences. And don't forget to like this video if you found it meaningful, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Together, we can inspire change in our lives and the lives of those around us. Remember, healing starts with us. Let's make the first move.